Welcome to the second last session here at Zuari. It's going to be a presentation by Nilakantan RS. It's about the book that he's written, South versus North, India's Great Divide. So please welcome Nilakantan RS.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. For starters, I'm glad to be in Goa. I guess I have to give you a little bit of context, right? I happen to be a middle class Tamil man. And if you happen to be a middle class Tamil man of a certain age, the thing about that defines you is that you created plans to go to Goa with your friends for 25 years and never actually went there, right? Today is my first time in Goa, so here I am. So, yeah. All right. Okay. So this is a book that I wrote, a couple of years ago, but I'm going to tell you, the genesis of the book because that becomes kind of important for why this even came about, right? In fact, I was talking to a couple of people here who sort of approached this particular subject from like a sociological, anthropological viewpoints. I am none of those. I work as a data scientist for a living. I am not qualified to comment on any of those things. So I sort of have refrained from commenting on that here, and I shall do that in this talk as well, right? So this is going to be a data-based analysis of essentially what are the various states of India and whether the modern Indian Union is even viable. Yeah. So that is the premise of the book, right? Then why is it called South versus North? Well, apparently this sells a lot of copies. So I'm not going to argue with that, right? Like, because when the publisher asked me to come up with like a title for the book, I came up with some obscure shit, which she thankfully vetoed, and this is the title. So yeah, there we are. So going back to the genesis of the book, I think it was in 2011. I was living in Madras at that time. Now I happen to live in Gurgaon, but like back then I was living in, I was living in Madras, and we had assembly elections at that time. If you sort of, if you're a citizen of a democratic society, and if you happen to have elections, and you happen to work as a data scientist for a living, what do? You do the most obvious thing that there is, which is that you calculate the probability of your vote having an impact on the elections that you're voting in. Yeah. So that is the normal. Yeah, I thought that was the most logical thing, at least for a person in my shoes to be doing. So that is what I did. Right. So the assembly constituency that I happen to live in is called Valasarvakam. I'm sure none of you know of that. But anyway, I calculated that. It came to be an absurdly low number. Ignore that. Yeah. Now, I don't see anybody who's sufficiently young here, but if you are, right, this is something that all of you should do. If you know, like if you have a high school level probability education, you should certainly go back and look at your own constituency and sort of model probabilistically what is the probability of your votes impact on your constituency. Yeah, it's a fun exercise, I promise you. Yeah, so go ahead and do that. And if you sort of have questions on that, I think I sort of, as a footnote somewhere in my book, I've actually added that. So you can follow that method for your constituency if you so choose to, right? But more importantly, I did that for my assembly constituency. It happened to be some absurdly low number. I got curious, so I did that for my Lok Sabha constituency, right? So again, if you're interested, it was e to the power minus 594. Yeah, it's just an absurdly low number, as you would expect. You don't expect anything different, right? Now, my parliamentary constituency happens to be South Madras. So yeah, whatever, right? Like, so my effect on that election is e to the power minus 494. Sorry, not 594, right? 494, and it was I thought, curious. Okay, fine. We got an answer. And what I did was, out of curiosity, I took a random constituency in, I was going to say North India, and then I got corrected so many times that, that constituency is not in North India, but in Central India. But if you happen to live in Madras, everything north of you is North India, right? So I happened to take this constituency called Guna, which happens to be in Madhya Pradesh. Just like completely random constituency, right? And I calculated the sort of probability of a median citizen's ability to impact the elections in that particular constituency. That happened to be about 40%, sort of even lower. That is the probability of impact. Yeah. Now, or in other words, the if you take the set of all constituencies in Tamil Nadu and take the set of all constituencies in either Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh, the average Tamil voter is about 40% more powerful, right? Like in terms of electing their MP. I thought, this sounded strange, and because we happen to live in a democracy. If you live in a democracy, its basic rule is one person, one vote. The basic assumption behind that is that every voter is equally powerful or not powerful, given what is the judgment that you have on the number e power minus 494, right? Like, but be that as it may, the point is that the Tamil voter should not be either less or more powerful than the voter in Madhya Pradesh or Uttar Pradesh. The voter in South Madras should be no different from the one in Guna, or for my book, I took the constituencies of Pollachi, which happens to be in Tamil Nadu, and Azamgarh, which happens to be in Uttar Pradesh. And the reason for that is entirely statistical, which is because these constituencies are closer to the sort of normative mean compared to sort of my constituency of South Madras. So it's just a statistical choice. But the point is that the median voter is so much more powerful in the state of Tamil Nadu. It's true for the state of Kerala, and it is not so for Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh or Bihar or Jharkhand or Rajasthan, particularly so for Rajasthan. Now, why is this? Yeah, and when I started digging into that, from 2011 to 2021, I sort of I was looking into that, and by that time my publisher got in touch with me and said, you should stop doing these long things on Twitter and instead actually write a book. And that's how this book came about, right? So anyway, so given that you have a brief history of how this book came about, now let's go here, right? Sorry. Okay. Now, so before we go into this, I want to tell you why this chart is important, right? If you were to look at any developing society, yeah, how do you judge the health of a developing society? It's not by like everybody in this room is happens to be middle class or above, and like for instance, I have gout. It's a pretty rich person's disease, right? It used to be called the king's disease because you just overate protein, and that's the reason why you get gout. Or you over drank wine, that's the reason why you get gout, right? Like that is not the measure by which you want to say how well a society is doing. The way in which you decide how well a society is doing in terms of its health is you find out how are its children, its infants doing? Yeah, because there are basic reasons, which is that if you have a child of less than 1 year, essentially that's how infants happen to be defined, in at least for the definition. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. The care-seeking behavior of a parent when a child is sick is normally distributed, right? So A, that. B, children do not die of complicated diseases like, they don't get gout, they don't get cancer, they die of elementary treatable diseases such as diarrhea. Yeah? And what do you need to prevent deaths from such simple diseases is access to the most basic of healthcare. So the question then becomes, if this basic healthcare is accessible, that society then prevents infant mortality. And ergo, the reason for why, when we want to measure the health of a society, we measure it using the infant mortality rate. Yeah. Now, so, and this is globally accepted, right? Like, if you, in fact, after I wrote this book, I happened to come across some research which basically said an increasing or a sort of volatile IMR, which is a high IMR, which is also volatile, is a reasonably good predictor of civil strife. And this has been true for multiple African countries. Yeah. So IMR is sort of crucial in that way, right? So I want to, this kind of, this, so the way in which this has been sorted is through this 2018 data. And the reason why this is 2018 data and not 2022 data, which is the latest data available, is because, well, I started writing this book in 2020, and the latest available data at that point was 2018, and my book got published in 2022. But I'll tell you that, the relative ranking of the states has not changed much since. So you can use this, right? So if you look at Madhya Pradesh, its infant mortality in 2018 was 48. Which are, let me ask you a question. With the exception of my friend Karan here, does anyone know another society which has a infant mortality rate of 48? Oh, certainly not. Madhya Pradesh is by far the worst. Actually, Pakistan does better, madam. Somalia actually does better. Yemen, I don't remember. Maybe not. I don't know. Afghanistan and Niger are the two countries with a number exactly 48. I think Chad is probably worse than 48. Maybe no, not Eritrea. Chad is, then maybe some other war-torn countries like Gaza probably in the last couple of years would have had a higher IMR. We haven't measured, right? But anyway, Afghanistan has like 48. Now, in the latest data, I think this 48 has dropped to 47 or 46, but doesn't make a difference, right? You look at Kerala, at the time I wrote this book, it was 7. Right now it's 5, right? Like in the latest measure. Tamil Nadu was 15, it's right now at 13, yeah? Now, at 6, which other country has an infant mortality rate of 6? The United States. Well, Sweden has 2. We have ways to catch up with, but the United States, yeah? Now, what does this tell you? Like India has within it an Afghanistan and a United States. And some bureaucrat in Delhi has the audacity to think that they can govern these two societies with a single policy that they make in Delhi. And that is the basic problem, right? And that is the essential problem that my book is trying to argue that, well, policy should not be made from Delhi. And it should be decentralized, yeah? And hopefully, the rest of the book is just a collection of evidences towards this end, yeah? Now, if you were to, and the reason why this table has 3 columns, this is important, right? Because if you see the difference between 1981 and 2018 is that, okay, Madhya Pradesh has terrible infant mortality rate. All right, some societies are bad, some bad in terms of a starting point. But what would you expect? You'd expect that societies with such terrible infant mortality rates at the least have a higher rate of improvement because, the problem is easier to solve when it is more severe compared to Kerala. Yeah? Except you see the exact opposite, which is that you see Madhya Pradesh's rate of improvement over, between the years 1981 and 2018 was 66%, whereas Kerala, which is the best state in the country by far, has an improvement rate of 81%, right? This is like your rich neighbor growing at a much faster rate compared to, your poor neighbor, which just makes absolutely no sense, right? Because it's as societies get richer and healthier, the incremental benefit takes more time and greater effort to show up. Except what you see is that Madhya Pradesh is not even plucking the lowest of hanging fruits. Right, and this is true for Madhya Pradesh. It's true for Uttar Pradesh, which it's particularly true for Assam as well, which has grown at 61%. Orissa at 70%. So these are all like states which were bad. So if you ask a bureaucrat in Delhi, they will always offer this argument, right? Like, yes, states in India are diverse, but the reason why we have the policies we do is the hope that with these policies, there will be a certain amount of convergence in terms of outcomes over time. Except what you see in the data is that instead of converging, they're diverging, right? And that is the basic problem that we have, right? And just park this in your thoughts while we move on, and I'll come back to this. As you would imagine, and I think the graph is kind of cut off there, but in general, it is true that the richer a state is, the lower its IMR, as you would expect. Like somebody said, Sweden has a very low IMR. Yeah, it's a very rich society. It has low IMR, right? Chad and Niger have extremely high IMR. Yeah, because they're war torn and extremely poor, right? So in general, it is true that richer places have lower IMR compared to, poorer places. But even there, right, what you would expect is that you'd want your state to be below this line, right? If there are states above this regression line, what that essentially tells you is that your state is not even doing as well as its level of wealth demands it be doing, yeah? Which is why, states such as Gujarat, Haryana are particular disappointments, right? These are relatively prosperous states, but they don't do as well as you'd want them to, right? So anyway, park that in your head while we move on, right? I want to tell you what actually sort of, results in this output metric of the IMR dropping, right? So if you look at, for instance, IMR versus number of hospital beds, it's sort of, the greater the number of hospital beds in your state, the lower the IMR, right? It's not complicated. It's pretty straightforward. And you can see the regression chart sort of dropping, right? And if you, again, the chart there is a little cut off, but what I want to, again, show here is, oh, I can't stand here really. Okay, so what you want is one of the biggest reasons for death of an infant is death during childbirth. And that happens when there is home delivery as opposed to institutional delivery, right? And therefore, what you want in general, there's like an entire movement of rich people going the opposite direction, but we're not worried about rich people. We're worried about the poorest of the lot, right? And therefore, if you look at states like Kerala, Karnataka, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, these have 100% or near 100% institutional delivery rates. Whereas if you look at states which we saw had extremely high IMR, these states have sometimes 60, 50% of institutional delivery rates. And we need to understand why this is the case, right? Now, the number of hospital beds that are available plays a very significant part, as you can imagine. But, even the basic infrastructure, right? And I go about this quite a bit in my book, which is that in the late 80s and early 90s, right? It was not as if, and I want to start, let's go back here for a minute, right? I want to tell you something, right? It was not as if, Kerala was always like a spectacular state. It has been for 100 years, right? Tamil Nadu, my home state, was not that. If you look in 1981 data, Tamil Nadu's IMR was actually worse than its neighboring other southern states. It was significantly worse than, let's take Punjab, right? Tamil Nadu's IMR was 91. Punjab, which by then was one of India's prosperous agricultural sort of states post-Green Revolution, was 79. So it was, but instead, if you look at it today, Tamil Nadu is like way ahead of Punjab, right? And the reason for that, if you look at it, is exactly these kinds of data, right? If you look at the number of hospital beds available per person, the total number of doctors available in the society, the number of PHCs available, the number of weighing machines that are available in these PHCs or Anganwadi centers, the number of nurses and primary health center sort of health professionals available, the number of medicines available in these primary health centers, the number of doctors who serve in those primary health centers, right? Every one of these metric, if you see, states which have done well and have a high sort of rate of improvement in this particular metric happen to have done at a much better rate. That is no wonder. If you sort of put in the hard work of governance, you get a certain output, right? Now, the question then becomes, shouldn't that state be making those decisions of, doing the hard work that it already had, or should it then sort of, renounce that and follow what is now called one nation, one fill in the blank policy, right? And that is the serious question, right? Now, that again, the chart in your far right, again, it's a little cut off and it's sort of, it seems like a meaningless sort of statistic, right? Which is mothers who had at least 4 antenatal care visits as a percentage, right? Now, Tamil Nadu, at the time I wrote this book, the latest data available was 2015-16. Right now, the latest data available, I think, is 21-22. It used to be 81%. Now it's at 89%. But the point here is rather simple, right? Which is that Jayalalitha, when it was her first administration between the 91 and 96, sort of institutionalized obscure things, such as she would give gold chains and rings to nurses who to walk the streets of every village in Tamil Nadu, and sort of, and if I encourage, if you ever happen to go to these villages with primary health centers, you should take a look at the registry, right? I don't know if other states do this, but Tamil Nadu does this, and it's sort of creepy sometimes, because every time like a new woman comes into the village, the nurse will write it down. New woman meaning new woman of reproductive age. She will write it down. Sometimes they will actually track their menstrual cycle, because they want to know whether they're getting pregnant or not. And if they are pregnant, they would be given these antenatal care visits, right? While it is complicated and a breach of privacy, it does its job well, which is to drop the IMR, right? Us middle class folk can sit in like air conditioned rooms and sort of worry about privacy of data. But if the outcome is your child not dying, I'm like, most people would probably take that, right? But the point then becomes these kinds of, having recognition for these nurses clad in white saris walking sort of every village in the state. Kerala always had this, but not Kerala always had a low IMR and therefore did not have to do this, but the neighboring state of Andhra Pradesh copied the Tamil Nadu system and it achieved an equivalent result, right? So the point is that states sort of innovated on the ways in which they wanted to incentivize their healthcare providers, and therefore they achieved this result. This is becoming increasingly impossible in the current sort of centralization drive that we have in this country, right? The number of the earlier metric that you saw in terms of number of hospital beds available and the number of doctors available per capita in each state. What the latest NEET sort of regime does is it kills that ability of a state to do those things, right? So essentially, the reason, in other words, what I want to impress upon you is that there is an output metric which is considered the measure of all health. And that output metric has a series of input metrics, yeah? And each one of those input metric is, at least until recently, used to be a decision that the state government can make in some way, shape, or form. And that ability of the state government to make those decisions is being increasingly taken away from the hands of the state government, and we are rendering that state government into a glorified bureaucracy which implements policy that is set in Delhi. Yeah, and that is the basic problem when it comes to sort of health, right? Now, you thought that was the problem with health. Let's go to education, right? And the reason why you see this chart, I know I sort of love regression charts, so excuse me for that, but this is important, right? Because the reason why this is important is, if you turn the pages of a newspaper or listen to the news, they would probably stop at literacy rates, right? But literacy rates include everybody from the youngest to the oldest in our society. It's not as if there are adult literacy programs, but they're not they're not a serious way that we solve, the literacy problems of people over 80 who have not ever been to school, right? We're not going to achieve that, right? So the way in which you want to measure how well a state has done is sort of to draw a regression chart between people who are 80 plus and people in the ages 10 to 14, because these are kids who should have been in school in the last 10 years, right? And what we want is, you want the state to be as far away upwards from this line in a perpendicular direction as possible, because that is actually what the state government has done, because this line is its demographic destiny. Whatever is above it is the result of governance, yeah? And if you look at this, what do you see here? Kerala, despite having extremely good literacy, still is above the line. Maharashtra, again, despite being relatively good, is still above the line. Look at Tamil Nadu. It has the highest perpendicular distance, yeah? But look at this. Uttar Pradesh, it has such low, that is, people above 80 weren't, much literate. But it almost looks like people in the ages 10 to 14 aren't any different, right? And look at Bihar and look at Assam. And that is the problem, right? That is, it's not as if these states had a historic problem. It is that these states are not doing anything about their historic problem with governance in the present day, right? And if some states are able to do it, and if some other states are not able to do it, the thing that Delhi should be doing is, hey, states that are not doing well, please look at the states that are doing well and do something about it, right? Except what we now have is a national education policy which sort of does the opposite, sets a single policy in Delhi. Yeah? And I'll give you a. So, here's my sort of, if you go and read the national education policy, what does it do? It firstly, it's so badly written that I really want to meet the person who wrote that. But secondly, I'm pretty sure, I'm not kidding. Like it's written worse than a college level sociology project. You should go read that, right? But more importantly, what does it say? It wants to let me. I'll come back to this chart. What it sets is, and this is gross enrollment in higher education. This is the target that the national education policy sets. If you look at Tamil Nadu, for instance, its gross enrollment ratio, I think this is for the year 2018-19. Sorry, I guess you can't read it, but it's 2018-19. And the gross enrollment ratio for higher education, which is college equivalent, for Tamil Nadu was 49% in 2018-19. In 2023-24, it was 54 or 55%, right? The national education policy, which came out in 2022, by which time Tamil Nadu's sort of gross enrollment ratio at that time was 51% or 52%, sort of set the target of 50% in 2035. Okay? Now, what do you want us to do? Just wait until everybody else catches up? And this is the problem, right? Like if you start setting policy for Uttar Pradesh or for Bihar from Delhi, then what you're essentially doing is you're telling states like, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Telangana, Karnataka, Maharashtra, like, hey, you guys stop governing for a while the others catch up. That's essentially what you're doing. And not just that, we will set policy for these states while we take your money to do that. And you don't have money to do whatever it is that you want to do. Yeah, and that is the basic problem, right? Now, and I want to show you this again, right? So, sorry for my fetish with regression charts again here, but what this is secondary versus higher secondary, right? So, what this tells you is that of the kids who finish secondary school, how many of them go on to join higher secondary school? And again, you measure it in terms of the distance from the regression chart upwards. So again, if you see there, look at the highest distance. So Uttar Pradesh sort of does an okay job here, surprisingly, right? But if you dig into the data, you find out that, they have, it's quite funny. I encourage all of you to go look at Uttar Pradesh's secondary school data, which is that I guess for some reason they do not let kids who they know are not going to go to higher secondary sit in their, I guess they flunked them out of 9th standard. It looks like, the data certainly sort of shows so ignore Uttar Pradesh for a minute, right? Because the data is funny there. But all the other states, again, if you look at it, you essentially see the same story play out one more time, which is that states which do well are continuing to do well, whereas the states that are not doing well, Bihar here, which has the highest sort of, perpendicular distance downwards, they all have the same problem. Now, the point is not that, Bihar isn't doing well. The point is that Bihar isn't doing well for its own sort of original base metric. And how do you solve for that is the actual problem, right? And herein is the other problem, right? Which is, now, how did Tamil Nadu, for instance, achieve, among all large states for here, in fact, Tamil Nadu's gross enrollment ratio in higher education, which is college and equivalent, is larger or higher than the city state of Delhi, right? Like the city state of Delhi has a gross enrollment ratio in higher education of about 49%. This is the latest data. And Tamil Nadu has like 54, 55%, right? Like this is an extraordinary piece of achievement. Now, the question then is, how did the state do that? For which you have to go into a little bit of history, right? The like we saw earlier, this state was not doing all that great, like 50 years ago, right? Like in fact, if you go look at 1950s data, what was or rather pre-independence data, more the erstwhile United Provinces, or now Uttar Pradesh, was no different from Tamil Nadu, right? Now, but if you start looking at the time in which the gross enrollment ratio in Tamil Nadu took off, you can clearly benchmark it to 1982, which is M.G. Ramachandran launching his midday meal scheme, right? Now, therein lies the lesson of our times, right? Which is, how did M.G. Ramachandran even do this? There's a history to it, right? Like it's a 100-year scheme. After the Montague Chelmsford reforms of 1922, the Corporation of Madras sort of started with this midday meal scheme for the first time, right? Like, but then the colonial administration sort of took the funding away, as colonial administrations do, and then Kamraj in 1955-56 sort of had a second iteration of it. But the problem that he had was that he had a complicated sort of cost-sharing formula between state and local governments, which was uneven, right? In 1982, what M.G. Ramachandran did was that he said the state will take on the entire burden, and in fact set up like a bureaucracy just to track and implement this, right? In fact, there's a very famous anecdote, which is that he went to Delhi and asked for support, and then sort of the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. Remember Planning Commission before it became what is now Niti Aayog? That's what it is. Anyway, so it used to have a deputy chairman. Remember that? So the then deputy chairman said, are you running schools or are you running hotels? It was the actual question. And do you know who was the deputy chairman who asked this question? May he rest in peace. It was a certain Dr. Manmohan Singh, right? So, and it was not as if M.G. Ramachandran was an enlightened politician who sort of saw what will happen 40 years later. It's that he was a populist politician, but this is the reason why we elect state governments. We elect them in order to sort of make moral choices on our behalf, right? That is the entire purpose of a democracy, yeah? Now, and how did M.G. Ramachandran sort of achieve this? He implemented an additional sales tax of 1.5% on everything, yeah? Right now, under the new GST regime, no state government can do this. So what have we done now? We've basically sort of condemned our states into A, implementing and adopting policy that is set in Delhi, B, taking away their ability to raise revenue to do what it is that they have to do, and C, finally, hold them accountable for what is terrible results for policies that are set in Delhi and funds that come from Delhi, even if you disagree with them. So if you open the newspapers yesterday, today, I don't know, in the last 3 years, you'd basically see Chief Minister Siddaramaiah or Chief Minister M.K. Stalin or Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan going on and on about some scheme or the other, right? Which sort of they don't agree with, and then the central government does not release that funds to them, and then what they say is this scheme is poorly designed, or they'll say we have a better version of this, and then what the central government will say is no, you have to follow this, and then the net result of it is that devolution does not come to the state, right? And so you have a complicated system here, wherein my home state of Tamil Nadu is like what, the size of Germany in terms of population, right? Like Kerala, like every state in India is the size of a mid-sized European country, right? It's not as if we go and tell these European countries they can't run their own sort of education, health, or any of these things, right? Except we seem to be increasingly doing that in 21st century India, right? And that is the problem. Okay, I need to move on quicker, so I'm gonna. Okay, so. So that was health and education, where my little rant has ended. Now, we'll go into the other thing, which is sort of, why is it that some states are richer and some states are poorer. And it is not as if these states were richer 40 years ago. These states have become richer in the last 40 years. And if you look at sort of the data and you start understanding why, it's a very clear sort of indication. You remember our good old friend Madhya Pradesh, right? It, for some reason, has the highest contribution of agriculture in its GSDP, right? And if you look at Tamil Nadu, which sort of has the highest sort of distance from the regression line in multiple such charts, if you look at that, it has, and Kerala, which has always enjoyed like spectacular indices in health and education, you see that their agriculture to GSDP ratio is amongst the lowest. What does this tell you? It essentially tells you a sort of sad reality of India, which is that agriculture is an unproductive, low yielding, disguised unemployment, right? And what is the cause, what is the symptom is a complicated thing, but essentially, if a state has a large number of people depending on agriculture, and that sort of their output forms a large part of the state's GSDP, it just means that the state is not doing much. This is just, they're just doing what because I live in Gurgaon, I've now learned this phrase called time pass. So that's what they're doing, right? So and toward this end, right? It's not you need to correlate this with this, right? If you look at this, basically gives you the state-wise number of workers in the organized sector, right? Non-farm labor. I can't, I also need glasses, so ignore that for a minute. But let me give you this sort of startling statistic, right? The highest number of people engaged in the manufacturing sector anywhere in the country happens to be the state of Tamil Nadu. It's about 39,000 people, right? Now, the states, and this, both in terms of, 39,000 factories. Let's just first deal with the number of factories, and then we'll go to the employment that it generates, yeah? So Tamil Nadu has about 39,000 factories. You know what this number is? This number is larger than the total number of factories in the states of Bihar, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand put together, right? Now, and this population of Tamil Nadu is, another pet peeve of mine, which is that we don't have a latest census. In the last census, it was about 70 million people. Yeah. Now, in the last census, the data for these 5 states or 6 states that I mentioned is about 500 million people, right? Now, the problem here is precisely that, which is that if you have a situation where a state of 70 million people has as many or actually more number of factories than 6 or 7 states with 500 million people put together, what you have? You're going to have a massive internal migration crisis, yeah? And we're already seeing that, right? And the corollary of that is, why is there that crisis, and what does that show up as? It shows up as disguised unemployment in agriculture in those places, right? All right. So, given that, we've sort of summed up health, education, and economy in a little bit, and for more details, please do buy my book and read it. But the point here is that, more importantly, all of you here pay income tax, right? Of course, we pay other taxes, but primarily income tax because, most of you happen to be of a certain class which sort of pays income tax. And like if you open social media, they all seem to think that income tax is the only kind of tax in this country. But anyway, be that as it may, the problem is that if you look at the 12th Finance Commission versus the 15th Finance Commission, what you see here is that, look at my home state of Tamil Nadu, for instance. In the 12th Finance Commission, it got 4.46% of the overall devolution. In the 15th Finance Commission, it got 4.08%, right? If you take the state of Kerala, it has gone down from 1.3 to, sorry. Yeah, okay. Actually, there's some error in this data. Anyway, so ignore that. Ignore Kerala for a minute. Focus on Karnataka instead. Where's Karnataka? Yes, so it's gone down from 4.46 to 3.65, for instance, right? So essentially, what happens is that for everything in this country, 1971 census data is kind of a touchstone, right? So what happened was that, the most illiberal kind of legislation ever made in this country, this 42nd Amendment, if I'm not wrong, which is what declared emergency, also had a little sort of rider in it, right? Which basically said that, the resource allocation of this country, including the number of MPs, for instance, would be fixed to 1971 population or benchmark to it, right? And that was the general yardstick. Except what the 15th Finance Commission did, and we have an upcoming delimitation. What all of these are trying to do is they're trying to take the latest census figures, yeah? And what happens when you do that? Because what this allocation ratio means is that the taxes that you and I pay, very little of it goes straight to the excuse me, state government. Most of it goes to Delhi and then gets devolved back to the states. Yeah. Now, the Finance Commission's entire purpose is to arrive at the ratio in which that particular devolution happens across states. That's called horizontal devolution, right? There's another thing called vertical devolution where we decide, how much the center retains for itself and how much the states get. That also is a problem, which we will come to the next stage. But in the horizontal devolution, wherein, you sort of are trying to distribute it among states, the problem is that typically we used to have population, which is the most important metric in that algebraic formula, set to 1971. But if you start taking 2011 data, what will happen is that the states which have had a higher population growth will end up taking up more resources, right? And that's the reason why I have this chart here. Between the years 1971 and 2011, I'll give you an example. The state of Kerala had a population growth in these 40 years of about 56%. The state of Rajasthan had a population growth in the same period of 168%. Yeah. Now, it's just impossible for what do you do in a democracy? The fuel that runs a democracy is people. Except if you have a manufacture of people on steroids, what happens to the system? It gets corrupted beyond belief, right? If you want to have a union, you need to have some kind of an arrangement, which is what the 1971 population arrangement was. Now, if that arrangement is broken, not just here, but also in the upcoming delimitation problem, wherein we're going to sort of do the same thing to MPs now, right? Remember the first thing that I started this with? How do we sort of, why is it that Tamil Nadu, for instance, the voter in Tamil Nadu has a much higher power? It's because of the population growth, right? Now, is it fair to the person in Uttar Pradesh that citizen, that voter is sort of valued less in our system? It's unfair. I don't want that to happen. But is it fair to the person in Tamil Nadu that just because, we sent girls to school, we end up with less of a power? That's unfair too. And why do I say girls to school? It's because if you go see this chart again, it basically tells you what is the fertility rate of women in terms of number of years of schooling. What you see here is the greater the number of years of schooling or education, the lesser the total fertility rate of that population. In other words, the greatest contraception invented by man is sending a girl child to school, right? And given that is the case, and why did Tamil Nadu sort of achieve this, for instance, for one example, it's the midday meal scheme, which was a state level initiative, right? Why did Kerala achieve that? For a whole number of state level initiatives, right? So, given this complicated system, how do we solve for this? We can do what Sudan and South Sudan did, and that'll be ugly and violent. We don't want that, right? So what is a better solution? The last third of my book essentially argues for what is called a gamified direct democracy, which sort of, mathematically, it hopes to arrive at a mathematical equation which sort of decentralizes power over time, right? It's sort of, I don't want to become a professor and write equations here, but that is, at least my sort of original contribution, I think, because the rest of the data is essentially government data that I've collated. And, I encourage all of you to read my book to get it, but you can open any government website and you get the same thing, right? So the point is, the first 2/3 of the book essentially restates much of the data that is available in public domain, except it collates in a certain order and from a certain point of view. But the last third attempts a solution, right? So, that's a more complex solution. So I encourage you to read it. And I've already been told there's probably less than 5 minutes now. So if you have questions.
Any questions for Nilakantan?
Yes, sir.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. Actually, two subjects, but very quickly. This central government, state government, essentially is what you're getting about. And India is still a union, but it's a federation, but it's still a union government. What about the next level below the state? I mean, how equal is it inside these states? Tamil Nadu versus, say, Madhya Pradesh and stuff. It'll be good to get a little bit more. Is there any data along those lines as well?
Sure.
And the second thing is,
Can I answer this first question first?
Yeah, go.
Because it's important. You know how the caste system works, which is that everybody wants liberation and equality until their caste. And then everybody wants to stand on the shoulders of everybody who is down the caste order. State governments are exactly like that.
Yeah, so basically it's all fairly power grabbing at the state
Yes.
level. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
if you happen to read another sort of somewhere else I wrote, I sort of, follow the minutes of the meeting of the resolutions that the Chennai Corporation passes. It's extraordinarily mind-numbing and how stupid they are. But I encourage all of you to go sit in your corporations and do this hard work, because unless we fight for it, nothing will happen.
Okay, the second question relates to this population divergence between the south and the north, which is going to lead to less Lok Sabha seats and all that nice stuff. I don't know what your solution is. It sounds very mathematical and probably nobody will understand it. But wasn't this the reason why you had an electoral college in the US?
Yes and no, right? The United States, for instance, has a more complex bicameral system where the Senate, that is their lower house, is quote unquote significantly more powerful, rather their upper house is significantly more powerful than their lower house in terms of having a veto, right? And however, more importantly, that house, which is the Senate, has 2 senators from each state. And this was achieved, what is that? Like they call that the Connecticut Compromise or some shit like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, the Connecticut Compromise's basic premise was that we do not want overreach of the federal government, and therefore we want all of this. However, what the federal government there did was they included all of this through what they call the Commerce Clause, which is the reason why Obama had Obamacare, whatever. So the point is, you can have any and all of this, right? However, if you make the union or the federal government or whatever it is that you want to call it, you give it a reasonable amount of power, the nature of power is to accrue more power to itself, right? And that is the basic question that we have, which is that if we want to have such a large union, by necessity, what we want to do is circumscribe the powers of that union to such low levels that you don't want to do anything beyond very basic things.
But why is it just a question of power and ability to pass laws and hold on to finances? I mean, why can't states develop their own industrial zones, get their own private citizens to start investing, a more capitalistic model,
They
but a
can't,
local?
because what is the incentive for a state to do that if they don't have the powers of taxation? Let's take Tamil Nadu's case, for instance, right? I'll show you this. So this is an interesting chart here, right? And it tells you a very interesting story. The first, I'll tell you the interesting bit, which is that, well, you and I can squabble about where you live and I live based on our states here. But the moral of the story, if you happen to be a citizen of this country, is that we all live here and then we all send money to the state. Right? So that is the basic problem.
That's the complaint, but I'm trying to look at solutions.
You cannot have solutions if the powers of taxation are not resident at the level of the state, right? So
Yes, sir. So, well,
she had a question.
yeah. Good.
Yes.
I promise I'll pass the mic to you. So, very rudimentary question. Maybe I missed something in the definition of IMR. Does that IMR, infant mortality rate, does that exclude infanticide?
No.
So it includes infanticide because I've been thinking about Madhya Pradesh. It really struck me as to why does it have. Anyway, I'm going to do my own investigation on that. Second question, education versus literacy really bothers me. NEP is definitely very badly written, and I don't know how much worsely is not a word, but anyway, how much worse will it be implemented? That's something we'll find out if we live to see it. Education and literacy, what are your thoughts on that? Because now kids are living their lives on smartphones, being educated by the written word of AI, and that is a big cause of concern in the education system these days, and we don't know what kind of educated kids we are now going to produce.
So, yeah, why don't you answer that question and I'll answer them together? Yeah.
So, I mean, you've got our numbers here, which is great. But actually, also, we got to look at the site. Even if they're passing the 10th standard or the 12th or what I think, how
Yeah. So I mean, you've got all the numbers here. So even if they're passing out of school, what have they learned? Like we see the news, these guys in Delhi getting 99 out of 100 in English, whereas when you meet them, I mean, they probably can't string sentences together. So have you also factored into the thing that okay, it's just not, even though maybe the numbers are so high in some states, what are they what is their real knowledge and what is their contribution to society and to the country in general just because they passed school or college?
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to answer this question in two parts, right? One, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If you have a state which has more factories and more employment generated than 500 million people in the other side, it's doing something right, right? So that. But more importantly, the reason why we want to measure gross enrollment as as a basic measure is that you want to get kids into school first. If they're not even in school, right, they're not doing anything. Yeah. Which is sort of the reason why I have and this goes back to the problem of centralization, right? Take Kerala and take Uttar Pradesh or Madhya Pradesh, for instance, right? Now, if you sort of have a gross enrollment ratio in higher education, which in Uttar Pradesh I think is 19%, right? Tamil Nadu has 54%, Kerala has some similar number, slightly lower. But what do you want here? You first want your kids in school, and then you want to worry about whether they're learning well or not. In other words, states which have a high gross enrollment, given that they've sort of jumped the first loop, so to speak, should now worry about educational outcomes. But if your kids are not even in school, you don't have to worry about what they're learning. Get them into school. Yeah, which is the exact reason why there was a midday meal scheme, which is MGR's original insight was because he grew up poor, he knew that the girl child would never be given food at home, because especially in a poor society, because the boy child had like sort of the first rights on food in that particular time of in that time in Tamil Nadu. Right now it's a slightly more prosperous society, but back then this was a truth, right? And so because he grew up poor, he had this insight. He sort of did this. Now, what is the effect of it? Immediately, in sort of a few years, Tamil Nadu bridged the sort of gender parity between gross enrollment between boys and girls. To answer your question, well, what did those girls do? Well, let me give you one statistic in terms of what those girls did. Of all manufacturing jobs that exist in the country held by women, 44% of them happen to be in Tamil Nadu, one state. That is the answer to your question, right? What did they do? That's what they do, right? So, to your question of, hey, they're watching Instagram reels and learning nothing. Well, at least they're in school.
So, I mean, I was confronted by this yesterday showing the 8-year-old in the pornographic image.
See,
It's gone to a point where
those are rich people problems, right? Those are rich people. Yeah.
Vasco Slappies. We're talking about Vasco Slappies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure those problems exist. Yeah, I mean, I'm not here to argue that those problems don't exist.
Sorry, they sounded like
yeah.
All right. We don't have. We're just out of time
Very
now.
quick one, last one. Is it allowed?
No, she's already asking the last one.
Oh, Goa is not included in any of the charts because my criterion for any state to become here was 9 MPs. It needed to have that for the mathematics to work.
Thank you so much, Nilakantan. Please, another round of applause for the Great Divide. Seems like a great divide. And our next session will start in another 5 minutes.